Good Friday afternoon, church family. This morning we actually read again from Robert Stein's Jesus the Messiah and speaking about his crucifixion. And I said that this afternoon we would just read through the last words, the seven last words of Jesus, or seven last phrases of Jesus, because there's so much meaning in that. I know a lot of sermons have been built around that. So anyway, I like the way that Stein lays these words out. So let's start reading there. The Gospels present us with seven different sayings uttered from the cross. Luke and John record three, whereas Mark and Matthew record one in common. Arriving at the exact order in which they occur is highly problematic. The traditional order is as follows: Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. Then, today you will be with me in paradise. Then, woman, here is your son. Here is your mother. Then, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then I am thirsty. Then I am finished. And, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. So, he's going to take these in a traditional order again. To be able to construct these and exactly the orders, difficult, even though we could probably just guess. Those last ones were probably exactly as they appeared. They do appear to be the last words he would have said. So he starts with, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. The manuscript testimony for this saying is mixed. Some of the earliest Greek manuscripts lack this verse. As a result, it is uncertain as to whether it was part of Luke's original writing or a later scribal addition. In favor of it being part of Luke's writing is the fact that in Acts 7:60, we have a parallel saying on the lips of Stephen. And since Luke intentionally sought to parallel accounts and Acts with what occurs in the gospel, this seems to certainly be equivocating to Jesus's actual words on the cross. The they to whom Jesus refers includes not only the ignorant bystanders, but also the Romans and Jewish leaders involved in this crucifixion. And although they knew what they were doing, they really didn't know what they were doing. And that's actually what Paul says in Acts 26:9, when he says, if they had really understood, they would have not have crucified the Son of Glory. So, or the Lord of Glory, I think he calls him. So, then that is the first one. The second one, truly I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. This is found again in Luke 24:43. Although at one time both the bandits crucified along Jesus seemed to ridicule him, Luke records that one must have had a change of heart. How this came about is not stated. We can only speculate as to whether Jesus' character persuaded him of his innocence or whether it was revealed to him in a supernatural fashion. Luke does not tell us. From this incident served as another witness of Jesus' innocence. Well, where earlier Herod and Pilate witnessed to his innocence, here even a bandit acknowledged his innocence. But he acknowledged it more. He confessed that Jesus is indeed the King of the Jews, and he requested Jesus remember him when he entered into his kingly reign. Jesus' response was the promise that when he entered into the full presence of God, literally paradise, he would bring the bandit with him. Needless to say, this saying has been an encouragement to many people over the centuries. Salvation is indeed by grace. There is no one so evil that there is hopelessness. So we can come to Jesus for mercy, find forgiveness, and eternal life as long as we can confess him. The third saying, woman, here is your son. And then he tells John, here is your mother. Rather than reading into this as saying of deep religious symbolism, it's best to take it at face value. Jesus was concerned for his mother's well-being and sought to provide care for her. He did so by entrusting her into the keeping of the beloved disciple who that day took her into his home. Whereas earlier Jesus had been responsible for caring for his mother, now in his absence the beloved disciple would care for her. Where the brothers and sisters of Jesus fit into all this is unclear. The idea that Mary remained a perpetual virgin after the birth of Jesus and that his brothers and sisters were simply cousins seems to fit strangely, although it seems to fit this scene, it certainly does fit strangely otherwise. The views that these were Joseph's sons and daughters by previous marriage does not fit this as well. And the view that they were Joseph and Mary's children is, I think, the best answer for that. Nevertheless, the evidence that Jesus' brothers and sisters were true siblings, sons and daughters of Mary and Joseph, is convincing. As a result of this, scene remains a strange thing. Why did Jesus not entrust his mother to her own children? Well, it could very well be, and Stein actually says this, that we see in John 7, that that they didn't believe. I mean, Mary seemed to believe. She kind of knew a lot. She knew before anybody, right? But the brothers and sisters do not. In fact, in John 7, they're still unbelievers. So it even appears that James, his brother, who actually writes the book of James in the New Testament, seems to be a convert only after his resurrection. So that very well fits this. In other words, why would he entrust him to his best friend, more or less, you might say? It's because this best friend believed him, and that's why. So the next saying is, of course, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is the only saying from the cross that is found in two Gospels. Both Mark and Matthew state it, that after it took place, darkness came over the whole land. The evangelists saw this darkness as deeply symbolic. Darkness is associated with divine judgment in the Bible, and the Gospel writers wanted their readers to know that judgment was coming upon the nation. Doubtless their readers saw this event, the events of AD 70, a fulfillment of this. And certainly remember, in AD 70, the temple is torn down, Jerusalem is sacked, and the entire nation of Israel had to basically change everything about the way they did everything from then on. No more sacrifices ever again. But Jesus is the final and ultimate and real Passover lamb, the one onto which the wrath of God is placed, so that those who embrace him can escape that wrath. And so this darkness over the land, after he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's a physical demonstration. It's a manifestation of what it is like to experience the wrath of God and be cast into the outer darkness. Numerous suggestions have been made as to what caused the darkness. It serves a theological purpose, of course, but it does not mean that the darkness is fictional. We actually believe there actually was darkness here. One suggestion that it was due to an eclipse, but this explanation is unlikely. For one, the maximum time for a solar eclipse is about 8 minutes, and the accounts say that this darkness continued from noon to 3 in the afternoon. So if you can imagine a real darkness in the middle of the day that lasts 3 hours. Second, a solar eclipse is not possible during the full moon at Passover. In other words, that's just an astronomy problem, right? Other suggestions are sunspots, volcanic eruption, or whatever. We simply don't know what caused the darkness from the metaphysical standpoint, but we know that God actually sovereignly caused the darkness, and in this way it serves that theological purpose, not only for those who experienced it in those moments, but for everyone who reads about it later. And so closely associated with this symbol of judgment is another symbol, and that's when this happened, the veil of the temple was rent into from top to bottom. So if this is the veil that separates the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary, the place where nobody could go except a priest in the right time and for the right purposes and in the right spirit and all the rest, well, the veil is torn there, and because of that, we find that we don't need any priest to come between us and the Lord, not for redemption, not for forgiveness, not for anything. We need no more priests. Hebrews is all about this. Read the book of Hebrews. Outstanding book to read and study on Good Friday. It talks about Jesus as the prophet, priest, and king. There's no need for anybody besides him. He makes the way perfectly clear. And throws the door wide open to the presence of God. There is none that can hold us out if we have Jesus. And so this curtain is no longer necessary or needed. It's an interesting thing as well that there are actually there's historical account of from the first century that somewhere in the vicinity of this time period, that curtain was actually rent, was torn, was somehow messed up, had to be repaired. Now, that was just astonishing, because I want you to think about something. That curtain was very thick. It couldn't be just torn any other way. And remember, they don't have the kind of technology we have either, and there was nobody that could get near that curtain and bother it. Okay, the priest that went in there actually at the appointed time had to have a rope tied to him, so that if he fell dead in there, he could be drug out, because they couldn't go in and get him. And so the fact that this was actually historically evidently ripped or torn, whatever you're going to say, because it was so thick, it's hard to really use the right terminology, is pretty remarkable. Okay, so my God, why have you forsaken me, comes from Psalm 22:1. In his desire to express his agony and sense of feeling forsaken, Jesus quoted a psalm of lament. He sensed, like the psalmist before him, that he was all alone in these moments, that God had left him comfortless. Although he was committed to obeying the will of the Father, suffering death by the way of the cross, he could not help but express the agony that caused. Okay? And this is not just a physical agony then. This is a real experience in which, to the depths of his soul, as both 100% God and 100% man, the Son of God really did feel to the depths of his soul the harshness of what it was like to experience the wrath of God. And so that's just another piece of, I think a piece of information that causes somber reflection. And knowing that, turning to his native tongue, Jesus quoted in Aramaic. And so he said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. On hearing this, some of the bystanders thought he was calling for Elijah, because in the Greek text, such confusion is understandable. For the Aramaic, my God, and the Greek, Elijah, Elias, so Eloi and Elias, they may have not heard him very well, so they thought he was actually calling for Elijah. That's why they say that. As a result, it's unclear, again, why this misunderstanding took place, other than the fact that he was probably so weak now that it was simply him speaking to the Father, and they could not make it out very well. So they offer him vinegar wine that soldiers usually drink, placed it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus. And John, this act is described as taking place after he says this. Then he says, of course, I am thirsty. This cry reveals something of the suffering and helplessness Jesus experienced. The tradition has placed this saying next to the previous one because of the similar response. A sponge filled with wine was offered to Jesus. It is uncertain in Mark if this offer was a form of mockery. Did he expect his readers to interpret this in light of Psalm 69:21, which says, they gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink? If so, it would be a hostile act. It is also uncertain in Mark whether the offer of wine was actually carried out. In John, the offer was not hostile but friendly, and Jesus accepted it. It is unclear in John whether the soldiers themselves offered Jesus this drink, or whether they permitted someone in the crowd to do so. John describes the wine-filled sponge as being on the end of a branch of hyssop. If this refers to the hyssop associated with the Passover, it is difficult to understand how this kind of hyssop could have borne the weight of a sponge. So we don't really know what that branch was. It was just some things are just simply unclear about the incident. But when he said, I am thirsty, they did give him a drink of vinegar wine, which actually was not like we think, oh, they gave him vinegar. Remember, all vinegar, it has some kind of basis in the same kind of thing as winemaking, right? It's just usually not as sweet. And so because of that, this kind of wine may have been something that was a cheap uh, thirst quencher. And so they certainly gave that to him when he asked, just a little bit on a sponge. All he could do was probably wet his lips, and that's about it. Um, so finally he cries, "It is finished." And then we see it in John 19:30. Jesus knew that his work had been completed. He had been victorious. He had completed the work he had been sent to do. And so doing, he fulfilled the will of God in Scriptures. These words are a powerful reminder against any and all who somehow suggest that to the grace shown on the cross something more needs to be added. It is audacious indeed to think that one could somehow add something to what Jesus did. Redemption is accomplished in him once for all. Father, and to your hands I commit my spirit. That's the last thing he says, evidently. And so Jesus spoke of his death at the Last Supper, and then he was confident when he did. One day he would share the messianic banquet with his disciples. Here too he was confident. Like the psalmist, Jesus believed that God would not hide his face, but would hear his cry, and that he would therefore live. Unlike the cry of agony, the prayer is a committal as addressed to his Father. So in other words, this is a very intimate moment with Jesus and the Father. So the Son and the Father, this intimate moment, and Jesus is saying, "I commend my spirit. I'm coming to you." And so Jesus does not see his death as defeat. He sees it as victory for his mission, as victory for redemption having been accomplished, and as a deliverance, because from that moment on, he'll never suffer again. And so we actually see a great deal of hope in that as well. The cause of Jesus' death is not given in the gospel accounts, obviously crucifixion, but remember, certain things go along with that. Could he have finally bled to death? Could he have asphyxiated, which was basically what most of the time would happen? Or it could have been something else. It could have been just a shock. I mean, there's a lot of things that would have ultimately been the result of the crucifixion that led to his death. But we know that his work was finished. Jesus' death was accompanied by many signs. The veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom. There was also an earthquake. Rocks were split in two. We actually see some support for these phenomena in Tacitus, the Greek historian, and his histories, and also in Josephus. We actually see reference to an earthquake at this time. These references, though, are somewhat ambiguous. Tombs were opened. Many of the dead, it said, were raised. Those raised entered Jerusalem, were seen by many. It's unclear how after his resurrection should be understood. It may indicate that whereas the tombs were open and the dead were raised to life, those resurrected from the dead did not enter Jerusalem until after the resurrection of Jesus. Or it might indicate that all of this occurred after Jesus' resurrection. In other words, when the earthquake happened, it might actually end up being tied to that first day of the week, that Sunday morning, when that rock was removed from the tomb. So we see the Synoptic Gospels record at this time a confession by the centurion, saying, "Truly this was the Son of God." This confession can be understood in the fullest Christological sense. That is the intention of the evangelist, to prove who Christ is. So when the centurion says, "Truly this was the Son of God," he is confessing the fullness of who actually Jesus is. So whatever was happening here when Jesus died, and the events around that were pretty phenomenal, and in some way God had worked in the heart of this centurion to see truth and to see Jesus for who he was. In John we read, because the following day was the Sabbath, the execution had to be brought to completion. It was not permitted for Jews to have their bodies to be left exposed in this manner on the Sabbath. So, To hasten to death, one would break the legs. A name was given to this procedure. Uh, and this both brought additional shock to the victim and made breathing more difficult and impossible. So once their legs were broken, what would happen is they would have no way to pull themselves up anymore, and the weight of their bodies pulling down against the arms that were hung would asphyxiate them pretty quickly. And so that was why they would do that. The legs of the two crucified by Jesus were broken. But when they got to Jesus, he was dead. And so they pierced his side. The soldier pierced his side. Blood and water came out. There is a lot of debate on how this should be interpreted. And there's no agreement whatsoever among scholars about that. So I think we need to be careful not to worry about interpreting that very much. And what we need to remember is there's an identifiable understanding. When it's pierced and we see blood and water, that's what's tied to in John, that he is actually already dead. So what it's saying is, look, this guy's already dead. And so we know without a question that when his side is pierced, anything that was in his body that would have been able to keep him alive in any kind of way, if he weren't dead already, it was certainly that way now. So by seeing this happen, we know that there's a death. We know without question that they're not putting a guy in the tomb who was just in shock and might recover. They're putting a guy in the tomb who was absolutely dead. So we see this as the crucifixion, of course. Then there's the burial, and then there's the waiting. Just a couple things on this day, on Friday. I think by sunset we should be thinking about the way that it must have felt for Jesus's mother, for his disciples, for those women who were close to him that we're going to see at the tomb on Sunday morning. How it must have been, to have been around him and then not to have him anymore. To know how it ended. I'm not sure they would have felt defeated. I just think they would have probably felt remiss or just lost in space and time for a day or two. I mean, it was certainly a time of uncertainty, and we're going to see that when they go to the tomb, there's just this idea that they're not sure what they're going to find. The women think they're going to find the body. They leave it alone on Saturday because they couldn't embalm a body on Saturday. It was a Sabbath. They come as soon as they could. So once daylight breaks the plane of the sky at all on Sunday, the first day, they could embalm it. So as soon as they could, they were going to be there to start this process. So they believed that they would actually find the body of Jesus there and that he was dead. We also see that they go and get some of the disciples, and Peter and John are there, and they're kind of not understanding, and for some reason John sees it, and it's evidence enough for him just to say, okay, whatever's going on, he's risen from the dead. This is no accident. And even though Jesus had said this, and even though we find the hope of resurrection in the Old Testament, and we can tie that to the Messiah in the Old Testament, in real time, this was just tremendous. Sometimes we gloss over just the depth of this day and what it really means, and we just gloss over how deep this really goes. And if we could have only been those people in that time. I think one of the things we see is not just that the disciples receive the Holy Spirit and all of a sudden they're empowered and brave. They see the resurrected Christ, okay? After this, they know what it was like to not know what was going on for hours and hours and hours. They know what it was like to lose this kind of guy out of your life and he's just gone, and look at how it ended and how terrible this was and what next. They know what it's like. So when they see him and they know he's alive, I can't even imagine what a change that must have wrought in every single thing that would have happened from those moments on. You talk about empowered with hope. You talk about I mean, look, man, those guys were brave. Those ladies were brave too, I'm sure, after this. We don't get as much information about what happened to those. But when you think about it, it's just amazing to know that they actually came in and and they are so emboldened by this that their whole life is about this. They go and preach. And Acts, they're scourged and they're sent off and told not to preach, and then the next day they're right back in the same place preaching because they know what's the worst thing you can do. You kill me. He's promised that we're going to follow him through life and resurrection. And so they know this, and it's just a tremendous thing to think about. Uh, Sometimes things get too deep for words, and this is one of them. So I pray that we just take some time and reflect on this today, and we see the importance of it, and we see how it should and does affect our lives. So y'all have a great, good Friday. Hope you're enjoying Right Now Media. If you've received an email and you've been able to log on, if you're having trouble with that, contact me or Cindy. We can help you with that. And I put a Billy Graham message on there that I thought was very good. You can find that go under First Baptist Milton, that our channel. Okay, you'll find it on there. And when you do, you'll see things for Bible studies. I also put a couple of really good Bible studies on. One is on Ephesians. The other one's eluding me right now in this moment. But the other is this Billy Graham message. And for the kids, for the youth, I actually put two Tim Tebow videos on. So the one that I'd like for us to probably concentrate on, if you're youth and if you're hearing this and you're a youth, or if you have a youth like Felix is watching right now, then certainly tell Hannah. It's Shaken by Tim Tebow. That's the one we're going to talk about on the next Zoom meeting for the youth. Okay. So we're going to post a devotional in the morning, and then nothing else, and then we will have Sunday service posted on Sunday morning like we have been having. So Cindy and I will video that tomorrow, upload that, and so it'll be ready to be shared on Sunday morning. So you all have a great Friday and Saturday, and we'll see you on here on Sunday.